Hey, Kelly.
Hey Mike, how's it going?
It's going good. How are you doing?
I am excellent. Excited today to talk about a little bit of Git in Azure DevOps.
That's cool. There's a lot of ways that we can use Git inside of DevOps,
hmm
but you have a particular way that you're going to talk about today, right?
Yeah, I think that we really want to focus today on three topics that I find I
Okay.
get the most questions about and that itch at me the most when I'm working. So we're going to start with like how you might organize your repositories. We're going to assume a little bit of Git knowledge here that you've worked with it once or
Yeah. Right. Right.
twice. So we'll talk about how you
Yep.
organize your repos, some branching models that throughout the years we've all found our favorites. We'll compare
Right.
some of the most popular ones. And then finally, if you have a branching model, you got to enforce that a little bit with some branch policies. So we'll close
Branch
out with that.
policies. I use them everywhere. In Azure DevOps, there's some really good options for branch policies too. So.
hmm It's something that's even come a long way recently with more and more ability to make it nice and flexible. So
Right.
super, super cool. So
Yeah.
starting with your repositories. So anytime you're working with a repo or with a team, anytime you're working with a code base, you're going to have your source that you're putting it somewhere. You've chosen Git, you're going
Yep.
to do a repo. And then it's how do you organize that code there? Do you have a monolithic repository? I see a lot of places do that where they've got just gigs and gigs of code in one repository, which means they've got one place to manage everything. So there's some nice
Now,
stuff
would they
there.
have? Yeah. So would they have like all of their source code
hmm
for all of their projects in one repo, and then how would they do that from like a build process? Because you may end up having a lot of different builds, or do you target certain check-ins and certain folders inside that repo
Yeah, it involves
for
more
for
setup.
monolithic?
Yeah, it involves more setup in those build pipelines where you're saying it's
Hmm.
not necessarily any commit to my main branch. It is any commit in this folder of my main branch or this component, and so
I
you have
see.
to organize
Yeah.
that a little bit differently down the line. And that is the reason why a lot of times people will go with not having a monolithic repo where they have, you know, 3 or 4 or 10 or 20 individual repositories. So, that's even what we've got in our project where our
Yeah.
infrastructure,
Right.
our web app, and all that are in separate repositories because they have a separate release cycle. They
Yeah.
have separate builds and all of that. So it can be a bit easier to manage in that way.
Yeah, and you can enforce branch policies a little differently depending on the type of code base. So let's say you have like a document repository where it's a bunch of markdown files or Word documents. You may not have to have such a rigid
Mm-hmm.
policy
Mm-hmm.
when you do commits and such.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and
Yeah. Okay.
that's another big advantage to the multi repo way of doing things. One disadvantage, though, is if I've got developers who are working on a lot of projects, say it's some legacy
Right.
code and they're supporting 4 or 5 different things, and they're constantly having to switch their repositories, moving pull requests around and checking on statuses in a few. They are, waiting to see if they have forgotten to push something out. So they've only got it committed locally, things like that. It can cause a lot of confusion if you have to do a ton of context switching.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
So
that's
there's yeah. Yeah. I got you.
yeah. So
But
I
with the
try to go
with
a
the
little bit in the middle,
yeah.
right? It's try to whatever your main focus is going to be, as most of your developers or the users are, keep that in one repo, and whatever your major delineations amongst your team are, that is when I have in the past separated repos.
I got you. So in our example here, we have Parts Unlimited and Parts Unlimited Core.
Mm-hmm.
These are basically two different technologies. I mean, they're both .NET, but one is the classic .NET, 4.7, I believe, is the version of that Parts Unlimited.
Mm-hmm.
But then the Parts Unlimited Core is using .NET Core, and in that case, we decided we wanted a different repository, and basically the Parts Unlimited repository is our archived repository. We're not going to make any more updates to it, but we
Right.
have that. It's there for historical
Mm-hmm.
reasons.
It gives
I
you a
got you.
fresh start. It allowed us, and
Yeah.
in a more production environment, that would mean that you could work completely independently with no interruption to production, and blow away everything without worrying about it. But that actually leads us right into branching strategies, because often you want to have something in production while you're working on something else.
I see.
And in Git in particular, branching is incredibly cheap, so you want to do it often. So I would almost argue
unlike
unlike TFVC, absolutely.
Yeah,
We're gonna go there.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Right, with TFVC and even with the older, like, do you remember Visual Source Safe way back when? I mean, it was the centralized repository really caused a lot of problems from the standpoint of how do I develop, do code fixes, and have production branches. And it was always like, okay, nobody commit to the branch until we're released, and it was a headache. So definitely Git is the way to go. I mean, obviously that's where everyone's going anyway.
Yeah, and you'd spend an entire day merging code between branches.
Yeah.
And it was such a headache.
It was a headache, yeah.
So,
it was a headache.
I mean, we've talked in the past, pretty much everywhere you go, you're going to use a feature branching model. Like, that's the basic kind of branch, where every bit of work that you do is going to be branched off your main branch, and you're going to do work and then dispose of it after you merge it back to main. But where you go from there is completely up to your team. There are lots of branching models out there, but it's really important to figure out what works for your team and to not be tied to anything, and to not be dictatorial about it. As long as you've got some branching going on, you're doing something right.
Yeah. Yeah, and we have said this so many times, is that it's, with the agile methodology or Scrum methodology, the most important thing is that the team agrees on the methods that you're going to do, right? So if I said, hey, we're going to use TFVC, right? And I am, that's the way to do it. The challenge becomes, and like all the team are like, no, we don't want to do that. But then you're the controller, right? You own you own DevOps, basically, Azure DevOps, because you're the administrator of it, you have God rights on it. And you're like, no, we're going to do a TFVC. And everybody hates that. And what happens is everybody does not enjoy their job, because now you're fighting with the repository instead of just working on code. And it kind of builds a little animosity. So what we have said time and time again is we have to do, as a team, make that decision. Obviously, if somebody needs TFVC for older reasons, hey, whatever. But when you go into Git, and I think this is where you're going, is when we get into Git, it is what's that branching process that we want to use. And look, I am really familiar with Git Flow, but I believe you're going to talk a little bit about Git Flow and then the other models, right?
Yeah, definitely. Git Flow, I think, was the standard for a very long time, and is kind of still people's default go-to. It's been around
it works.
Since basically, I think, the invention of Git. As long as I've been using Git, Git Flow has been a thing.
There's even plugins for Visual Studio for it.
That's one big advantage to it, right? Is a lot of these tools, it'll be like, start new feature, and it'll initialize all your Git Flow stuff.
Everything for you.
So that's one good reason to go with it. To me, the disadvantage to it is, and you can see in this diagram here, is it's complicated. There's a lot of branches going on, a lot of things moving, and I find that often your develop and your main branch become somewhat redundant. Why do you have two of these? So I have become,
why do you need it?
I've become a recent adherent to the release flow strategy, which is what actually the Azure DevOps team themselves use. And it, to me, addresses some of my complaints with Git Flow. The idea being that you have a more trunk-based development process with a main branch. You still have your feature branches, and you branch for release at, say, the end of your sprint. So I think it goes really well with Agile.
Do you have to? Yeah. You were talking about the release branches, and why do we have release branches and not just deploy out of master branches?
The main reason for it is that when I have pushed something to production, I now have to support that in production without interrupting my ongoing development. So I want to have my ongoing release branch, which I deploy from. So I say, release 129 is my end of my sprint, and it's ready to go to production. It's out there, and then I know I have a snapshot of what's in production. So,
But once you have that,
hotfix,
so okay, so just a question on that. But don't you have? So you have all your change, all your change logs, right? So every commit and the commit ID has a history of everything that's going to go. So if you're doing a continuous delivery on this, you would have a lot of these branches if you're doing, unless you're doing a release at the end of every sprint. But if you're just doing, build, deploy, build, deploy, to build, deploy, would you still do that? And I don't know.
No.
I can understand why Microsoft would. So
I think not. And Microsoft, they release every 3 weeks, so that's a
I see.
sprint.
Okay.
So they're not doing every time a new feature is done, it's released. So and that
Okay.
I find is, people might talk about doing continuous delivery. Often they are doing still sprint based or regular
Sprint-based,
cadence
okay.
based, and that's when you have that release branch. Otherwise, yeah, I would deploy out of master, and master is continually production ready, and you'd want to ensure that that is happening. But otherwise, I would be wanting to have that release branch that is made every 3 weeks. And then if I'm not supporting multiple versions, as soon as I go to 130, I'm going to delete 129. So I may not have multiple release branches out there. When I'm done with it, it's gone. I dispose of it, and I don't have to worry about it anymore. Really like that. And it's pretty simple to do. It's not all that different from other sorts of branching. So if I'm just looking here at my repository, I'm doing parts unlimited core. I don't have any branches here. I do have some branches, I lied. So you can see some old branches of internal workings that I was doing. And we haven't really instituted much in terms of releases on this. So here's a good opportunity. So say I'm working on something, and I'm going to create a branch that's a feature. I'm going to say feature / and this takes some of those lessons of what Git Flow started with, of naming your branches in a certain style. I like the feature, and then I can say something that is being worked on.
Now there's
descriptive
a
branch
little,
names.
if I'm not mistaken, if you with Azure DevOps, if you start the name of that feature / right at the end of the / with the ID of a work item, doesn't it auto associate?
It will. So if I have a work item 1, 2, 3, 4, I can go feature / 1, 2, 3, 4, something that is being worked on, and it'll automatically link that. You can still
That's
do it
awesome.
at points later in the process,
Yeah.
but that's something that's nice and
Yep.
convenient.
So it is good in my opinion, I think that's a best practice, is having your feature branch named the ID of the work item. And that way, when if you're looking at any branches that haven't been deleted, maybe you don't, some people keep their branches forever, but what happens now, you're able to find that correlates to that work item. You can say, oh, okay, this feature, when you're just looking straight at the repo versus looking at the commits that are with that change. So I think it's, but anyway, sorry.
That auditing is really helpful. So I just, pushed my branch out there. You can see I already forgot to set the origin on it, but that's simple enough. So say I'd made a change on that branch, I push it out there, and then inside of Azure DevOps, when I'm looking at my branches, I'm going to see that there, and it organizes it inside of my folders. So I've got that feature, something that is being worked on. So you can organize things that way. And then if I want to merge things, move things around, it's all organized in this manner.
And we just for everybody that's watching, the all of these other branches that you see here, those are because we pulled this entire project from GitHub to get us started with everything, pretty much, right? Or from the demo generator, I believe.
This is a demo generator,
that pulled everything
and I
in.
forked it.
Yeah, and so that's why we have all these. We don't know all the people that are authored of these branches, but these branches were already there when we forked it and pulled it into our repo.
And there's probably some cleanup that we should be doing, but you can see kind of everything that's going on here. And if I look at master, then say I'm done and I'm ready to release, I can even create a branch directly from here, and I'm going to say release, and then let's say sprint 2. That, and now I have a release folder with my sprint 2 item. So everything is organized and nice and isolated, and I can apply things as needed there. So now let's talk about some branch policies, because I think that's pretty critical here. So I'm going to look at my settings for my repositories, and this to me is the easiest place to update your branch policies, because you can do a lot of like wildcards to set things up so that I don't have to do it on an individual basis. You know, we talked about with builds that I don't want to have to look for every individual release. I want to just do things that are named release. So I can set policies like that here across the board. So there's a few here. We'll just talk about this in general first. But I'm going to say protect the current and future branches matching a specified pattern. So I'm going to do, they even suggest that for you, everything that starts with release /. And it'll show me some examples of this. I'm going to create that policy. And I'm going to say I want, you know, at least 3 reviewers. Because this is a release one, I want to check for linked work items. So this says that if I'm committing something to a release branch, if I'm doing a pull request there, it has to have an associated bug or story or some sort of backlog item.
Some work item, yeah.
And then again, because this is release, I may want to say that you can't rebase onto this, that you have to do a squash, or you know, however I want to manage that history of that particular branch within the release branches, I can limit those as well. I don't find that I use that very often, but in release you may want a cleaner history. The build validation is incredibly helpful, because especially, I would probably say you should do this on any branch, but when I do a pull request, I want to go ahead and attempt a build so that I know before the PR can be completed whether or not it breaks the build, and then it won't allow that PR to complete, so that you can never break main, or you can never break a release branch. All of that is nice there.
It won't make that commit into that branch if the build fails for some reason.
Yeah, exactly.
So I have clients. We do a lot of database tests when we commit, and so what happens is they will have that build that every time they try to commit to their master branch, it will go out, run a whole series of database tests, because it's a lot of interaction with database. So they have it, and they'll spin up a new environment, push all the changes to database, run all the database tests, and then break down the environment, all during a pull request. And if that fails, then that code, which could have pretty devastating consequences on the database if that database testing doesn't pass. So they can't even, so they go and do a lot of tests, not just on does the build, but does everything do what it's supposed to first. So there's a lot you can do in the build for a pull request before it's even built for production or to be sent to any server. Okay.
So, and as we talked about earlier, if you have a monolithic repository, I may want different reviewers to see different parts. Say I've got my database in the same repo as my web app. I may want different people looking at that. So I could say, okay, you know, Kelly does web development, so I want to make sure that she looks at anything in the, you know, web folder. That's not a real folder that we have. Or I, you know, can make sure that Mike looks at anything that I do in infrastructure, because he's great at Terraform. So you can really customize these things as part of these policies. And these wildcard cross-repository policy means that I can have consistent things across all of my teams, across all of my environments, so that I can ensure that we are using a consistent development practice.
Is this global for all projects in Azure DevOps, or just for our one Parts Unlimited project?
It's just for our Parts Unlimited project. So if you're doing something where you have lots of projects and you want similar policies, that is something that I think we'll talk about a little bit later. You can script all of this and actually work through the Azure DevOps API to consistently update and deploy these types of policies. It's all just JSON in the back end, and you can deploy those out in a consistent manner.
That's cool. I like it.
So you can see that I created that policy here. If I look back at my branches, you'll see in release that if I look at my branch policies, you'll see that it automatically applied these, and it's going to say, that it's inherited this from something else. So it's applied to my individual branch, but it's inherited from something that applies to multiple branches. So
very nice. I like it. Yeah.
Some cool stuff there. So I think that's a quick tour of some things that we recommend inside of Azure DevOps, and with Git in particular. While we've talked about branch policies as they apply to Azure DevOps, this works in pretty much every Git tool that is out there. You could have these kind of branch policies, and you should be setting them up. Whatever your team decides is the policies that you want to work with, that's what you should be doing. And you should have
I would certainly not start off with the most restrictive until a team, I mean, you may have to, but if you're a new team or it's a new project, you probably would want to start off a little less restrictive, just to kind of get used to how everything works. Or you could take the extreme and say, turn everything on, and then kind of back off as you need to. So I don't know that there's a right or a wrong way. I know what has worked for teams I've been working with is go a little less restrictive and see how the team responds to it. And if you have to tighten the screws a little on it, then do that. And also, I would imagine it also depends on how fragile, not fragile, but how important the code is from is there any PHI information? Are there huge security risks that you have to watch out for? Is there PII information, credit card information? If I were writing a banking app, I may have a lot of controls around this, because I'm heavily audited. But if I'm a blog website that I don't have any auditors checking, I may not have any controls or policies, except for, hey, make sure I have a comment. That way I know what I did on that commit. So I guess that's what makes this really flexible and very, very important for the teams is, hey, look, we don't want to restrict our developers, but there may be reasons we have to have 3 people review the code versus 1 or 2 people. So again, just as we've said many times, is always work with what the team needs to, and least restrictive as what's required for your team, to make sure you have good solid code. The builds on a pull request, I think, are super critical too, to make sure that we don't break the build. So it'll build, but it will fail that commit into that other branch. So this is fantastic.
Yeah, it's I will say, even on my own personal code, if it's only me as a developer, I still protect my main branch and require PRs to it, just because I don't want to accidentally do something there and then have to worry about resetting things and reverting things. And I just protect it. I prevent myself from making dumb mistakes. So it's convenient there. So
yeah. Well, awesome. Thank you.
I think next time we're going to be talking a little bit about how you might connect this to some other services, whether that's Git or builds or anything. So look forward to talking about that.
Yep. All right, Kelly. Thanks for the
Mike.
demo, and thanks for going through it. Take care.
All right.
Bye.
Bye. Don't forget to like and subscribe. And if you have questions or topics you'd like us to cover, let us know in the comments. Thanks for watching.